The distress beacon had been running for 9 hours before Rail accepted that no one was coming. He sat on the floor of the navigation bay, back against the console, legs stretched out in front of him. The emergency lights had switched to their lowest setting to conserve power, and the whole ship was a deep, dull red like the inside of something dying. The hull made noises, small pops and groans, the ship adjusting to the cold of deep space as non-essential systems shut down one by one. Rail had stopped counting the sounds. There were too many. His name was Rail Dunn, junior navigator aboard the Dorthani freighter Alvin's Wake, and 6 days ago he had been thinking about what he would eat when they reached the Vreth 9 supply depot. Now the depot was gone, the crew was gone, and he was alone in a ship that was slowly losing its ability to keep him alive. The gravity shear had come without warning. That was the thing about the Vreth 9 corridor. It was rated stable. It had always been rated stable, and then without any signal or precursor event, a fold in local spacetime had opened beneath them like a mouth. The ship had been pulled sideways, hard. Systems had failed in sequence. The hull near the cargo section had cracked along an old weld, and then came the evacuation call. Rail had been at the navigation console running a course correction when the hull lock sealed. It was an automated response to the pressure differential. The door to the escape pod bay had registered the crack in the hull as a breach and locked every exit in the forward section. By the time anyone realized what had happened, the pods were already gone. He had watched their heat signatures move away on his screen, one after another, until there were none left. After that came the fleet. The Dorthani High Fleet had responded to his distress beacon within 2 hours. That had felt, for a short time, like hope. They had assessed the situation thoroughly. He knew because Fleet Coordinator Aurel had read him the full assessment over the channel. The ship was too deep in the sheer corridor. Sending a rescue vessel would risk another fold event. The cost-benefit calculation did not support the operation. Rail had been categorized as unrecoverable. Aurel had said it in the same voice he used for cargo manifests. The fleet had jumped away 4 hours ago. Since then, Rail had done 3 things. He had rechecked his oxygen reserves 11 days, assuming no further pressure loss. He had eaten one of the 6 ration packs remaining in the nav bay, and he had left the distress beacon running, even though he knew the nearest shipping lane was far enough away that the odds of anyone receiving it in time were not worth calculating. He did not turn it off. He was not sure why. Maybe because turning it off would mean accepting what Aurel had already decided. On the 6th hour of waiting, Rail began cataloging small things. He counted the rivets on the far wall. He recited the navigational tables he had memorized as a student, all the star distances and corridor ratings. He thought about his mother's house on the Dorthani homeworld, the way the light came in through the side windows in the early part of the day, warm and slightly blue. On the 9th hour, something changed. The beacon console blinked. Not the beacon itself that was still broadcasting, something else. The receiver. It was picking up a return ping. Rail got up off the floor so fast he hit his shoulder on the edge of the console. He read the signal. It was not Dorthani. The frequency pattern was wrong, the encoding structure unfamiliar. He ran it against every known species in the ship's database. The database returned one match, flagged as low confidence. Human Terran vessel. Rail stared at the word for a long time. He knew about humans the way most Dorthani knew about them, through third-hand trade reports and fleet summaries. They were considered unpredictable, biologically strange, from a young world that had expanded too fast. There were no formal agreements between Dorthani and human territories. Most Dorthani who encountered humans did so briefly, at neutral stations, from a distance. Rail had never spoken to one. The signal pinged again. It was not a random bounce or a relay echo. Something had received his beacon and sent a deliberate response. Whatever was out there had made a choice to answer. He stared at the receiver for a long moment. Then he opened the channel. Nothing for 3 seconds. Then a voice came through, lower in register than a Dorthani voice, slightly rough at the edges, speaking in standard trade band language with an accent he had never heard before. "Distress vessel, this is the survey ship Pharaoh's Reach. We have your signal and your position. We are reading critical oxygen and power status. Confirm you are aboard and alive." Rail opened his mouth and found that his throat had gone completely dry. He swallowed. "I confirm," he said. "One survivor. The ship is not maneuverable. I am—" He stopped. He did not know what to say next. "I was told no one was coming." A pause on the other end. Then the same voice, calm and direct. "Well, we are coming. Hold your position. Don't touch the power relays." The channel stayed open. On the navigational display, a new contact appeared at the edge of his screen, a ship, dropping out of FTL, its trajectory already curving toward him. Rail sat back down on the floor, not because he was giving up, because his legs had stopped working properly and he did not entirely trust what was happening yet. The red emergency lights hummed around him. The hull made its small sounds. Something was coming. The ship on Rail's display was not large. That was the first thing he noticed. It was smaller than a Dorthani patrol vessel, compact, angular in a way that looked almost improvised, like something built by people who added pieces wherever they were needed rather than following a design. Its hull was a dull gray-brown, marked in several places by repair patches that were a slightly different shade than the original material. It looked, in Rail's honest assessment, like it had survived several things it probably should not have. It also was not slowing down in the way he expected. Most ships approaching a vessel in an unstable zone would decelerate early and hold a safe distance while they assessed. The Pharaoh's Reach was coming in close, very close. Rail watched its trajectory on his screen and felt a new kind of anxiety that had nothing to do with his oxygen levels. "Pharaoh's Reach," he said into the open channel. "The Vreth 9 corridor has active gravity shear. Your approach vector puts you within range of—" "We know," said the voice. "We mapped this corridor on the way in. The active fold is 11 kilometers spinward of your position. We have room." A brief pause. "Barely, but we have it." Rail did not find that comforting. The human ship matched rotation with the Alvin's wake, or tried to. The freighter was still in a slow, uneven spin from the original shear event, and matching it was not a clean process. Rail watched the Pharaoh's Reach make 4 adjustments in less than 2 minutes, each one precise, each one fast. Whoever was at the helm did not hesitate between corrections. Then the voice on the channel changed. A different person, male, with an even rougher accent. "Navigator on the distressed vessel, I'm going outside. Your starboard docking collar is the least damaged. I'm going to get a manual clamp on it. When I tell you, I need you to cut your lateral thrusters completely, even the emergency ones. Can you do that?" Rail looked at his console. "Yes, but if I cut lateral thrusters, the ship's spin will increase." "I know, I'll be fast." Rail did not ask anything further. He found that he could not think of a question that would help the situation. A human was going to walk outside, in deep space, next to a ship that was actively spinning, and manually attach a docking clamp, in the same conditions that had caused Rail's fleet to classify him as unrecoverable. Rail watched through the external camera feed. The human Pieter, he later learned the name, came out of the Pharaoh's Reach airlock in a suit that looked older than most of the ship. He moved along the hull using magnetic contacts in his boots and gloves, pulling himself hand over hand toward the docking collar. The Alvin's wake was rotating. Pieter timed the approach, waited, and then pushed off the hull of his own ship, crossed the gap between the two vessels while they were momentarily aligned, and landed on the Alvin's wake hull with both hands grabbing a structural rail. He did not miss. "Cut thrusters," Pieter said. Rail cut the thrusters. The spin increased, as expected. On the external camera, Rail could see Pieter moving along the hull toward the docking collar, fast, not panicked, just fast, pulling the manual clamp housing open and beginning to set the anchor points. The collar mechanism on the Alvin's wake was partially fused from the shear event. Pieter hit it twice with something Rail could not identify from the camera, and then it opened. 4 minutes and 17 seconds after Rail cut the thrusters, the clamp engaged. The spin slowed, then stopped, as the Pharaoh's reach took on the stabilization load. "Good," said the first voice, the captain's voice. "Pieter, come back in. Navigator, we're going to pressurize the docking collar. It's going to take about 8 minutes. Stay where you are." "Understood," Rail said. He stayed where he was. He was not sure he was capable of moving anyway. When the inner door of the docking collar finally opened, 2 humans stood on the other side. The captain, Dara Osai, he would learn, was a dark-skinned woman of middle age, with close-cut gray at her temples and an expression that was calm in a way that seemed structural, like it was simply the way her face was built. Behind her, Pieter was still removing sections of his EVA suit, which had clearly fogged at the faceplate from the exertion. Dara looked at Rail. Rail looked at Dara. He was aware, suddenly, that he had never been this close to a human before. She was taller than he had expected. She had 2 eyes in the front of her face, which he knew from reports but which was still strange to see in person. She looked at him with something that was not pity and not clinical interest, something in between that he did not have a word for in his language. "You're the only one aboard?" she asked. "Yes." "Injuries?" "My shoulder, pressure wound, nothing else." She nodded. "Nneka will look at it." She stepped to the side and gestured toward the ship interior. "Come on, we'll get you warm first." Rail stepped across the threshold into the Pharaoh's reach. The air inside smelled completely different. Warm, slightly metallic, with something underneath it, food, maybe, or something biological he could not name. It was strange and a little overwhelming, and he stood in the corridor for a moment just breathing it. Behind him, the docking collar sealed. He was no longer on a dying ship. He was not entirely sure what he was on instead, but it was not that. Dr. Nneka's soul had a way of working that Rail found difficult to interpret. She did not explain each thing before she did it, she asked. Before she touched his shoulder, she said, "May I?" Before she adjusted the light over the medbay table, she said, "This will be brighter, is that all right?" It was a small thing, but Rail noticed it, because most medical staff he had dealt with aboard Dorthani vessels simply worked. Efficiency was the standard. Asking was considered a slowdown. Nneka did not seem to think asking was a slowdown. The medbay was small and organized in a way that felt almost overcrowded, instruments in labeled holders on every wall, a fold-out examination surface, storage under every flat area. There was a framed picture above the door. Rail could not read the text beneath it and did not ask, but it showed a landscape, somewhere green, with a pale sky. "I have to be honest," Nneka said, gently pressing along the edge of the pressure wound on his shoulder. "I don't have much data on Dorthani physiology. I know some basics from the General Species Registry, but I want you to tell me if anything I do is wrong for your body. You know it better than I do." Rail considered this. It was also not a thing Dorthani medical staff said. "The wound is superficial," he told her. "Our skin layers are thicker than most species registry entries account for. The bruising goes deeper but heals faster than it looks. You do not need to close it." "Good to know. What about pain response? Do you use anything for it, or is it not relevant to you?" "It is relevant. We simply do not usually discuss it." Nneka looked at him briefly, not with judgment, just acknowledgement. "I have something mild that should be cross-compatible. Tell me if it's wrong." It was not wrong. When she finished, she made notes on a small handheld device, writing quickly. She told him she was documenting everything he shared so that if he needed further care at Breck 7, they would have a record. She said it plainly, not as a favor. Rail went to find somewhere to sit. The ship was not designed for non-human visitors. The corridors were human height, which was fine. Dorthani were not dramatically different in size, but the furniture was shaped around human bodies, and every chair required Rail to sit in a slightly incorrect position. He found a bench along the wall of the common area and sat there instead, which worked better. Peter came in, still in the lower half of his EVA suit. He looked at Rail, looked at the bench, and put a tray down on the table nearby. "Eat something," he said. "Don't know what Dorthani eat, but this is mostly grain and protein, should be fine." Then he sat down at the table himself, across from Rail, and began eating his own meal without saying anything further. Rail looked at the tray. The food was in blocks, dense, slightly compressed, warm. He picked one up and tried it carefully. It was not unpleasant. It had almost no seasoning, which his palate registered as neutral rather than bad. He ate slowly. Peter ate steadily. Neither of them spoke. After several minutes, Rail realized something. The silence was not uncomfortable. Peter was not sitting there in silence because he was ignoring Rail or because he was waiting for Rail to perform some kind of gratitude. He was simply there, present without pressure. Rail did not know what to call that in his own cultural vocabulary because there was no exact equivalent. The closest phrase in his language roughly translated to shared stillness, and it was considered a mark of deep familiarity. Peter did not know that. He was just eating. Later, Dara came to sit with him. She brought 2 cups of something hot, a drink, not water, and set one near him. He did not drink it, but he appreciated the gesture in a way he could not immediately articulate. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Your fleet, they were in contact with you before they left?" "Yes." "And they made a formal assessment?" "Yes, I was categorized as unrecoverable. The rescue cost was calculated to be too high against the outcome value." Dara was quiet for a moment. There was a shift in her expression that Rail noticed, but could not fully read, something that tightened briefly around the eyes before settling back into calm. "Outcome value," she repeated. "It is standard triage protocol for deep space incidents." "I know what it is," she said, not sharply, just clearly. She drank from her cup. Then she said, "I want you to understand something. We came because you were asking for help. That's the start and end of it. Nobody on this ship did a calculation." Rail looked at her. "You were mapping the corridor. You were not a rescue vessel." "No." "You had no obligation." "No." "Then why?" "Because you were asking," she said again, as if saying it a second time would help him understand that she was not hiding a more complicated answer behind it. She was not. It was the whole answer. Rail did not respond right away. He looked at the cup of warm liquid near his hand and thought about his mother's house, the light through the windows, the careful and quiet logic by which Dorthani life was organized. He thought about Aurel reading him the cost-benefit assessment in the voice he used for cargo manifests. Outside the viewport, deep space moved slowly past, cold and enormous, and full of distances too large to measure. He picked up the cup. He did not drink it, but he wrapped his hands around the warmth of it and held on. The transmission came in on the 3rd day. Rail was in the common area, attempting to understand a human game that Bex, one of the younger crew members, had been trying to teach him since the previous evening. It involved small flat pieces with numbers on them, a circular board, and a set of rules that appeared simple but had hidden layers that kept revealing themselves whenever Rail thought he had understood. Bex was patient. She did not show frustration when he misread a rule. She just pointed to the relevant piece and explained again, and when he made a move that was technically legal but strategically terrible, she grinned and said, "Bold choice," in a tone that made it clear she meant the opposite, and somehow that was funny rather than unkind. Rail had not laughed during those 3 days. He came close, right then. But then Dara appeared at the common area doorway, and her face had the particular kind of stillness that Rael was beginning to associate with something that required careful handling. "Rael," she said, "there's a communication for you from the Dorthani High Fleet." The game pieces stayed on the board. Rael followed her to the bridge. The transmission was already cued. Dara played it with Rael present, which he noted she did not listen to it privately first, did not filter it, did not prepare him with a softened summary. She just played it. The voice that came through was Fleet Commander Soth. Rael knew the name. Soth held authority over the entire Vreth corridor sector. His voice was measured and formal, each word placed with the care of someone who had long ago decided that precision was more important than warmth. Soth informed them that the Dorthani High Fleet was aware of Rael's recovery by the vessel Pharaoh's Reach. He expressed, in the careful language of official communication, that the Dorthani government would appreciate the return of their citizen at the earliest convenience. He further noted that the incident involving the Alvin's wake had been logged under standard deep space loss protocol, and that the filing of any external incident report by a non-Dorthani vessel would be. He used the word unnecessary. He used it twice. The transmission ended. Nobody on the bridge said anything for a moment. Then Dara looked at Rael and asked a question he had not expected. Not, "What do you want to do?" or "We should probably comply," or any of the things a person in her position might reasonably say when dealing with a formal government communication. She asked, "Do you want to go back?" Rael heard the question. He sat with it. It was not a complicated question in its words. It was an enormous question in what it meant that she was asking it at all. Soth had issued a communication to the ship. The natural assumption, in Dorthani terms, would be that the ship's captain would determine the correct course of action based on diplomatic and logistical factors, and Rael would be informed of the outcome. His preference would be a footnote, if mentioned at all. Dara was asking him first. He stopped. He tried again. "I don't know," he said honestly. "It is my home. My family is there. We can get you to Breck 7 regardless. You can arrange your own transport from there if you prefer. Soth will expect a direct return." "Soth communicated with my ship," Dara said, "which means he's dealing with my ship's response." She paused. "What do you want?" Rael looked at the transmission console. He thought about what it meant that Soth had called Rael's abandonment a standard protocol. He thought about the word unnecessary, applied to the idea of anyone formally acknowledging what had happened. "I don't want to go directly back," he said. "Not on their terms." Dara nodded once, then she opened the channel. She did not draft the response or ask anyone else to handle it. She opened the channel and spoke, and her voice was exactly the same as it always was, calm, even completely ordinary. She told Commander Soth that the Pharaoh's Reach had recovered one survivor from the Alvin's Wake incident. She said the survivor was in stable condition and would be delivered to Neutral Station Breck 7, where he would have access to Dorthani consulate services and could determine his own next steps. She said that the Pharaoh's Reach would be filing its standard recovery log, as it did for all deep space rescue operations, because that was their procedure. She said it without apology and without aggression. She said it the way someone says a thing that is simply and completely true. There was a pause from Soth's end that lasted longer than transmission delay could account for. Then Soth said, stiffly, that the Dorthani government would note the delivery arrangement and expected prompt consular contact from Rael upon arrival at Breck 7. Dara said, "Understood," and closed the channel. Pieter, who had been standing at the back of the bridge, pretending to check a monitor the entire time, made a quiet sound that was not quite a word. Rael stood very still. He was aware that something had shifted, not dramatically, not with any announcement, but the way the temperature in a room shifts when someone opens a window. Something had changed in the air. Dara turned from the console. 3 more days to Breck 7, she said. Bex wants to finish teaching you that game." She said it as if the last 10 minutes had been a minor interruption in an otherwise ordinary journey. Rail found, to his own surprise, that his chest had loosened somewhat, a physical sensation he associated, in Dorthani terms, with the specific relief of being considered. "I made a bad move," he said, "in the game before we came in." "She'll make you replay it," Dara said. "She always does." Rail went back to the common area. On the fourth day, Rail started paying attention to the ship differently. Not to its systems or its structure. He had already quietly mapped those out of habit, navigator's reflex, but to the people in it, and the strange ecosystem they had built together inside these gray metal walls. He had spent the first days focused inward, on his own shock and exhaustion. Now the shock had quieted enough that he could look outward, and what he saw was genuinely difficult to categorize. Pieter and Bex had a fight on the fourth morning. It began over a toolkit. Bex had used one of Pieter's calibration instruments without asking and left it in the wrong storage bay, and Pieter found it by accident when he reached for something else. The argument was loud. Both of them raised their voices. Pieter said several words in his original language that Rail's translator did not catch. Bex said something back in what Rail assumed was her own home language, equally sharp. It lasted 4 minutes. Then Pieter made a sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite a laugh, took the calibration tool and walked away. Bex followed him into the maintenance corridor. 5 minutes later, they came back out together and Bex was showing him something on her handheld, pointing at it with the same hand she had been gesturing angrily with minutes before, and Pieter was nodding. Rail watched this from the corridor doorway, baffled. Among the Dorthani, a disagreement of that volume would have required a formal cooling period, at minimum a full rotation cycle, before the parties would interact again. Social friction was managed carefully. Voices were not raised unless a situation was categorically severe. The fact that these two humans had argued loudly and then simply stopped, and that stopping appeared to cost them nothing, was something Rail could not fit into any framework he had. He asked Nneka about it, later, in the way he was learning to ask humans things directly, without the Dorthani practice of building up to a question through contextual statements. Nneka thought about it. "We don't hold on to things the same way," she said. "At least they don't. Some people do, but Pieter and Bex have been on this ship for 3 years. They know each other well enough to argue and not mean much by it." But they were genuinely angry. "Yes." And then they were not. "Yes." "How?" Nneka paused. "I think," she said carefully, "when you trust someone enough, you can be angry at them and it doesn't damage the trust, because both of you already know the anger isn't the most important thing." Rael considered this for the rest of the afternoon. That evening, Dara sat with him in the common area. She had brought a navigation chart, a hand-drawn one, on actual paper, which Rael found startling, and spread it on the table to show him the route they had taken through the Vreth corridor and what their mapping had found. He looked at the chart and found several places where her calculations were close to his own knowledge of that sector. He pointed one out, a gravitational relay point that was usually used by Dorthani fleet vessels as a positional anchor, which she had not marked but had drawn a question indicator near, as if she had sensed something was there without knowing what it was. "There is a relay station," he told her, "unmanned. The Dorthani fleet uses it for long-range positioning checks. It would not appear on open navigation records." She looked at where he pointed, how far off the main lane. He told her. She made a note on the chart in a small, precise script. "You could share that officially," she said, "if you wanted, through the consulate at Breck 7. Open navigation data helps everyone." "The fleet would not want it shared." "Is it yours to share?" Rael had no immediate answer. He had not thought of it that way before, whether navigational knowledge belonged to the institution or to the person who held it. They sat with the chart for a long time. He told her other things, minor, non-sensitive details, current patterns in the Vreth sector, areas where the sheer events were becoming more frequent than the old charts reflected. She listened without interrupting, which in his culture was the most sincere form of attention a person could offer. At one point he mentioned this, that among Dorthani, uninterrupted listening was considered a sign of deep respect. She looked at him. I didn't know that. I know, he said. She absorbed this. Then, I was just listening because it was interesting. I know that too, he said. It was still respectful. She smiled, a small one, the kind that seemed to arrive without being fully intended. Rail found that he had been cataloging the types of human smiles over the past 4 days. There were several distinct kinds. The one Dara had just produced was, in his assessment, the rarest and therefore probably the most genuine. Toward the end of the evening, he asked her the question he had been holding since their first conversation. You said you come to places like the Vreth corridor because something might need you there. Is that truly why you do it? She leaned back. Mostly, there is also pay, and we like mapping, and Pieter becomes difficult to live with if the ship isn't moving. She paused. But yes, that part of it is true. Does your government support that reason? She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a breath out. They support the mapping part. Rael nodded slowly. He thought about a species that went to the most dangerous and empty places in the galaxy, officially for navigation data, and in practice because something might need them. He did not have a word for that in his language either. Breck 7 appeared on the navigational display as a cluster of docking lights, pale against the dark, a neutral station, mid-size, built into the hollow of a dead asteroid by 3 different species over several decades. It was neither beautiful nor ugly. It was functional, which was all neutral stations ever needed to be. Rail stood at the bridge viewport and watched it grow larger as they came in on the approach lane. He had been on the Pharaoh's Reach for 6 days. 6 days was not a long time, but something had changed in him during those days that he did not yet have the right language to describe, not in Dorthani, and not in the standard trade ban language he used with the crew. Pieter found him at the viewport, about an hour before docking. He stood beside Rail without saying anything for a while, which was very characteristic of Pieter. Then he reached into the chest pocket of his work jacket and took out a small tool, compact, flat, with a worn grip and a thumb wheel on one side. He held it out. Micro-torque driver, he said, calibrated to my preference, which is probably wrong for Dorthani equipment, but the mechanism is universal. He paused. Bex wanted to give you something. I told her I was already giving you something. She gave you something anyway. He pointed to the common area table, where a folded piece of paper sat beside the game board they had never quite finished. Rail took the tool. It was heavier than it looked. He turned it over in his hands. Thank you, he said. Pieter nodded and walked away. This was also characteristic of Pieter. On the paper from Bex were the rules of the game, written out by hand in clear, oversized lettering, with small drawings beside each rule to illustrate the point. At the bottom, she had written, "Next time you'll beat me," and underlined it once. Rael folded the paper carefully and put it in his inner pocket. Enneka met him in the corridor near the docking collar. She handed him a folded document, printed, dense with text, in Dorthani script. She told him it was a medical summary of everything she had observed and treated, cross-referenced with the General Species Registry, and annotated with the information Rael himself had provided about Dorthani physiology. She had written it in his language overnight. I'm not certain my translation is perfect, she said, but I tried to be accurate. Rael took the document and looked at the first line. The translation was not perfect. There was a grammatical structure near the opening that would have read awkwardly to any Dorthani physician, but it was clear, and it was careful, and it was in his language. She had spent her night doing this. He did not say anything for a moment. "Thank you," he finally said. "Take care of that shoulder," Nneka said, "and eat properly. You barely touched half the things we offered you." "The diet range was limited," he said. "I know, I'm sorry about that." "It was enough," he said, and then because it was true, it was more than enough. Dara was waiting at the docking collar threshold. She was in her work jacket, hands in her pockets, watching the station dock crew run the final connector lines outside the viewport. She looked at Rail when he came to stand beside her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The station was making its sounds, the mechanical language of connections being made, pressure equalized, locks engaged. She took something from her jacket pocket and held it out. A small card, physical, which she explained was unusual but deliberate. A contact frequency, printed clearly, with the Pharaoh's reach identifier below it. "Not official," she said, "just in case." He took it, he looked at it for a moment, then looked at her. "I want to say something," he said. "All right." "My fleet calculated that I was not worth the cost of recovery." He said it plainly because there was no way to soften it that would make it more true. Their calculation was based on standard protocol. It was logical by every measure they use. Dara waited. "You came anyway," he said, "without a calculation, without an obligation, without anything that my people would call a reason." He paused. "I do not have a word in my language for what you did. I have words for duty and for strategy and for cost and for protocol. I don't have one for this." Dara looked at him steadily. "What word would fit if you had to find one?" He thought about it. He thought about Pieter on the hull in the dark, moving fast and not missing. He thought about Bex and her rules written in large, careful letters. He thought about Nneka's imperfect translation that she had stayed up to write. He thought about Dara's voice on the channel, saying "we are coming," as if it were the most ordinary sentence in any language. "Showed up," he said finally. He had heard Bex use the phrase. "I think the word is showed up." Dara's expression did the thing it sometimes did, that small, unintended shift. "Then their math was wrong," she said quietly. The docking collar opened. Station air came through, recycled and neutral, carrying nothing. Rail stepped across the threshold onto Breck 7 and turned back once. The Pharaoh's reach sat behind him, worn and angular, marked with its years of repair patches. Already, through the viewport, he could see Pieter moving back toward engineering. He held the contact card in one hand and Bex's, folded rules in his pocket, and Nneka's document under his arm. Then he walked into the station. Behind him, the docking collar sealed. Somewhere in the dark past the viewport, a battered gray-brown ship was already calculating its next heading back out, toward the empty places, in case something needed it there.